This is for beekeeping for beginners, and then of course beyond. And I never ever miss an opportunity for a bee pun. This is me next to what would be about a 10-pound swarm. And there's no pictures of me putting my hand right through it, but I sure did. Swarms tend to happen kind of first thing in May, and then they can go into June and July. There's actually a really good kind of old-timey saying where a swarm in May is worth a bale of hay, a swarm in June is worth a silver spoon, a swarm in July isn't worth a fly. And it's actually fairly true, and hopefully by the time I'm done this presentation, it will make more sense. But yes, swarms are actually really gentle when they're kind of just out here hanging loose. That's why I was able to put my hand through it. And it's mostly because they actually have no nest to defend, which is why they're actually so gentle. And there is one queen usually hanging around in there somewhere. So a little bit about me. I worked and studied at the University of Guelph's Honeybee Research Center for 6 years. I participated in a lot of studies. I filled this noggin of mine with so much information. That's actually a really nice thing about apiculture and the study of beekeeping is that it never plateaus. There's going to be more and more things that you can learn. Apiculture too is actually a really, really important aspect to human survival, basically, and human health as well. And that's actually through the avenue of pollination. Because without bees, as we all know, we'd be really having a hard time getting our fruits and vegetables. And yeah, we would probably suffer a lot if we didn't have bees. So I've been working in the apiculture industry for 15 years. I've worked for many commercial pollinators, commercial producers as well. So a few to mention would be, well, the University of Guelph. I worked for Jim Conybeare. I worked for Chatsworth Honey, and a few more up in this area. I've worked alongside Hugh Simpson as well, and just name dropping all over the place. I was invited to stay on to do a master's project, and it was on the gut parasite Nosema cerana. It's a tricky little parasite, basically, that causes diarrhea or dysentery inside the hive. And because of my stubborn, incessant nature, my professor gave me this project that was actually really boring and really hard because he knew I was stubborn enough to finish it. Anyway, and so that actually taught me a lot of tenacity and discipline. And then, of course, as I've already mentioned, I love everything bee related. That actually also includes growing plants for bees to live off of, and of course, gardening. And yeah, doing what I'm doing with you all today, sharing the love, sharing the knowledge. So I've slowly been coming up the backstretch with a business idea. It would be a non-for-profit business that I really am hoping to launch this year. I actually want to launch community apiaries throughout Grey County. And from what I can tell from my years of experience, this is actually a fairly novel idea. It's similar to what a community garden would look like, in so much that instead of you going out and venturing out on your own, trying to buy all the equipment, trying to mentor yourself, you would then be able to actually come to one of my community apiaries. You could keep bees with much less of a risk. You could actually have the experience, and then of course the mentorship that I would love to be able to offer. And so my company, or my business that I'm hoping to launch, is called Our Bee Lab, and it would be much about therapy. So the therapy that you get through actually keeping bees, the education, I could talk until kingdom come, so there wouldn't be a worry there. And then of course we could do a lot of citizen science or research. This picture is actually from Durham, the Riverstone Retreat, where I work for Elephant Thoughts, and we actually had kids ages 6 to 12 come out and visit the beehives. And it was a wonderful experience. There were so many kids that were so apprehensive and so scared in the beginning, but after we got all suited up and we got our little smokers going, we went and we saw the bees. We even petted them on the frames. And by the time we were finished, everyone was just so excited, so in love with bees. And actually, quite honestly, no one was stung by a honeybee. It was actually the wasps that were causing the problems at the summer camps. So if you feel like it, you could consider joining our Bee Lab sometime later on this spring. And I have my website and my Instagram at the end of this presentation. So that's a little bit of a plug, but again, it would be a not-for-profit, and I just want to make beekeeping kind of more readily available for people who are interested. So just a quick presentation overview. I'll be sure to take breaks because we all need them. First and foremost, being a beekeeper actually involves knowing a lot about honeybee biology. And we're going to actually discuss some of the basics. I'm going to introduce you to beekeeping and all the equipment and all the strategies and kind of like mindset that you can have as a beekeeper. We're going to talk about hive products. We're going to talk about the importance of pollination. And my Zoom, oh, there, I can move it. And then we're going to be talking about native bees and other pollinators as well. And when I move that panel, do you guys see that as well? Yeah? We just have a Zoom panel here at the bottom, and I'll move it up when we need to read the last point.
When you say move your panel, what do you mean, Janine? What are we supposed to be seeing? I see your mouse moving.
Yeah, okay. I think it might just be my Zoom panel then. That's just on my end. That's good.
Okay, cool.
So can everyone see the last point then, the native bees and other pollinators?
Yes.
Great. Wonderful. So before we begin, any comments or questions? Again, I really do appreciate kind of the open forum sort of style. Good. All righty. So as Lori already has stated, we'd definitely like to thank our sponsor, and that's Strengths Bee Farm. They're actually located out in Bognor. I'm pretty sure we all know where that is. And they are selling honey, nukes, and equipment. And their website is there. It's a really nice website. And I actually spoke to Patrick in person, well, no, sorry, on the phone on Saturday. And he'd be very delighted to let everyone know that he does do some custom equipment as well, in case you actually have specific equipment needs. He'd be more than happy to customize some equipment for you. Okay. So an introduction to beekeeping, why keep honeybees? And then of course what it takes to keep honeybees is a lot of time, a relative amount of money, perseverance, a whole lot of patience, and a lot of understanding as well. So I think we all kind of heard each other explain why we keep honeybees. Why I keep honeybees is that they're basically an extension of myself. They provide me with a really good grounding experience. I tell it to the bees all the time. When I feel like I'm overwhelmed with whatever life is throwing at me, I can just put on my bee gear and I can go out and I can literally tell it to the bees. They're great. They're great little listeners if you know how to talk to them. And so when it comes to time, I would say depending on how many hives you have, you should not let your bees go unchecked for no more than 2 weeks. I can explain why. It's always good practice to check them at least once every 7 days. Too much checking, like if you open or disturb the colony, say every day, I wouldn't recommend doing that. But a few times a week tops would be not bad. And then yeah, try not to go more than 2 weeks checking them, if in case you get busy, right? When it comes to money, if you're starting out, again, it depends on how much you're hoping to spend. I have a lot of strategies. I call it guerrilla beekeeping, where you can kind of make do with other things. You kind of just improvise. You don't need to go out and buy all the fancy beekeeping equipment because there are ways around that. And I guess to start out, if you're buying a single hive, it shouldn't be really anything more than $350. I don't really know what the demand is going to be looking like in the spring, but I will wholly expect it to be fairly high. If you haven't paid any deposits for any nucleus colonies yet, or nukes, I would suggest contacting your beekeeper and putting a deposit in. If you leave it till late March, you might find that there's actually nothing left to buy. A lot of beekeepers actually sell out by that time. So if you are planning on ordering your nukes, I would suggest doing it straight away. And then perseverance, of course, just don't give up. If you feel like your heart is going to bottom out because your bees have died, it's okay. It's part of the learning journey. And I am here at all times. I'll be open to helping you through. Patience, of course, with yourself and with the bees. And of course, the weather, that is definitely something that we can't control. And then understanding. So by the time we are finished learning about bees today, it is my ultimate desire to make sure that we actually all understand our little furry friends a little bit more. So here is the wonderful world of getting stung. I'm going to talk about getting stung. I'm going to get it out of the way as soon as we can. This is what happens when you basically are walking through a bee yard with your mouth open and you get stung on the upper gums, and you look like a weird inbred Julia Roberts, basically, with a huge lip. And yeah, beekeeping and getting stung, of course, are part and parcel. And it just is kind of the way of being the beekeeper. I will say after a few months of getting stung, the swelling did go down. Your body does respond. I do get stung now and I barely feel it. I'm not being braggadocious either, but that's part of the perseverance piece. Is getting stung is still really painful. I mean, I'm not necessarily used to the pain, I just don't swell anymore. But yeah, it takes a lot of perseverance. It took me about 5 months for me to stop reacting to the bee stings. And then sometimes, of course, you just end up looking like this some days, and your friends wonder if you're okay. And you just say, yeah, I'm a beekeeper. First and foremost, when you get stung, it's actually really important that you get the stinger out as soon as you can. And usually the stinger will actually go in one direction. And it's best if you try to get the stinger out that you actually try to remove it in the way that it went in. So try not to like bend it back or scrape it the opposite direction, because it can break off and stay in your skin and cause an infection or septicemia, and you don't want that to happen. So try to get the stinger out as soon as possible, because there's a little tiny pump in the stinger that will actually continue to pump more venom into your skin. And if you can get it out, the less venom you get into your system. And then of course, be mindful of where you wipe that stinger off on, because the stinger is actually, it's got this thing, it's called alarm pheromone. And it's a pheromone that all the worker bees have. And of course it's in their stinger. And it's basically a pheromone that communicates to the other bees to sting here, the danger is here, or the predator or the enemy is here. And it actually smells like bananas. So you may or may not want to smell your sting the next time you get stung, but it will smell like bananas. That's the alarm pheromone. So do try to wipe it or get the stinger out, but make sure that you wipe it like on the grass. Don't wipe it on yourself, because you're just spreading the alarm pheromone all over your clothes. If you wear gloves while you're beekeeping, definitely be mindful. Try to wash your gloves periodically too, because your gloves are going to end up smelling like alarm pheromone if the bees are actually stinging them. And I find, I actually, again, not bragging, but I don't wear gloves when I'm beekeeping for that very reason, because it does end up making the bees kind of agitated if you don't wash them. And then of course, I don't like being kind of stumbly. I like the kind of like the nimbleness that I have by not wearing gloves. It makes me kind of a more careful beekeeper too. So there are definitely so many different kinds of bees in our world. There are bees, there are their cousins, the wasps as well, and hornets. And so we actually have our honeybee. It's kind of a little bit more robust, a little bit more boxy. Of course, it's got the classic yellow and black stripes, but of course the honeybee is really, really furry. It's nice and furry, and that's actually to help it collect pollen. You have your yellow jackets and your wasps. They are indeed still in the same family. It's Hymenoptera. So they are indeed related to bees. And they quite often are found on flowers that bees are found on as well. Wasps, however, are actually carnivores. Wasps will eat other insects, and they can be really beneficial actually in your gardens. So wasps aren't quite the enemy, they've just gotten a bad reputation. And I should mention that honeybees actually only eat two things. It is the nectar and the pollen. So they're kind of like oddly enough, they're actually, it's really fascinating. They're kind of like, they're not vegans per se, but their need for sustenance, like their food is actually what creates life. Like there's actually nothing that honeybees do that needs to die, right? Like the honeybees don't actually have to kill anything in order to survive. They actually, through the act of needing nectar and pollen, they actually create life through pollination. So that's actually a pretty unique example in biology and in science and in the world. And yeah, nothing needs to die. Honeybees give life. And then we have our glorious bumblebees. They're just absolutely my favorite. There are at least 20 different species of bumblebees in Canada, and they're actually native to North America. Honeybees are not. Honeybees have been basically brought over through the settlers, the colonizers. The colonizers brought honeybees to North America about 500 years ago, and it was indeed to pollinate their crops that they brought with them as well in order to feed their livestock. So that kind of goes all the way back. So honeybees have indeed been called the white man's fly for that very reason. And of course, it is our responsibility to make sure that we don't kind of inundate our environment with too many honeybees, and we do actually pay attention to some of the more native pollinators like our bumblebees, who, let's be honest, could be doing a little bit better when it comes to population. So we're actually just going to now discuss the three kinds of honeybees or castes. We actually have on the left here, we have our worker bee. And so you can see she is indeed the smallest of the three. We have the queen, who is indeed the largest. And then we actually have, well, she's the longest. I would say the drone is actually the largest. So you can see a clear distinction. You have your worker, and then there'll be thousands of workers inside the hive, so they'll all kind of end up looking the same. There's only one queen bee inside the hive, and again, she is really elongated. Her abdomen is really, really elongated, not only to hold all the sperm that she has in order to lay all the eggs, but her abdomen's long enough to be able to reach the bottom of a cell to deposit the egg at the bottom. And sometimes you'll be able to actually watch her doing that. The queen and the worker survive the winter. They actually overwinter together. You shouldn't really expect to see any of the male bees, the drones, overwintering at all. And they actually start showing up when the colony is doing well enough. They have enough resources to start rearing drones. And that would be in around late April and early May that they'll start showing up. I call them the football players of the hive. They're really, really boxy. They're a much bigger bee, like they're unmistakable. And they actually have really large eyes that touch at the top of their head. So your worker and your queen bees, their eyes won't touch. There's indeed a gap, but the drones actually, their eyes do connect at the top of their head. So that's another clear distinction. During peak summer, during peak production, you actually have about 40 to 60,000 bees in one colony at a time. So when you're looking for your queen and she doesn't have a mark on her back, it is literally trying to find a needle in that proverbial haystack. But have patience, because she is in there, and there are definitely ways, if you don't find her, there's actually ways that you can still basically take note of whether or not she is there. Am I going too fast? I tend to, no? Okay, great. Good. So we're just gonna break it down. We're gonna talk about the queen because she is the numero uno, basically, of the hive. There is only one queen per hive. She can live up to 3 to 5 years. There is only one queen allowed per colony. If you find two, that means that you are basically, your colony is about to swarm, basically. She can lay about 2,000 eggs a day, which is incredible. She actually is indeed the only one who's allowed to lay eggs inside the colony. Worker bees can lay eggs. It's a kind of a bit of a tangent that I'll leave there for right now. But worker bees can lay eggs. They really shouldn't. But if worker bees are laying eggs, that means that you basically don't have a queen. And then, of course, the queen, after she goes on her mating flight and comes back and starts laying eggs, she's really not expected to leave the hive unless, of course, there's a swarm. But she does rely on the workers to groom her, to feed her, and to actually, sounds a little bit inappropriate, but the worker bees actually also eat her poo, her excrement. She's actually the only one who's allowed to poo inside the hive. And the queen does have a stinger. I've never been stung by a queen bee, but I've actually seen two queens basically fighting to the death. So queen bees have a smooth stinger, but it's really only for fighting other queens with. And it's called a battle royale. And that's, of course, if there are two queens inside one colony and they tend to fight to basically be the only queen inside that colony. Any questions about the queen so far?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
How often do you requeen your hives?
So I do like, again, it's very circumstantial. So if your queen is kind of chugging right along and there's a really good egg production and everyone seems okay, I tend to start thinking about replacing after 3 years. And so this is why we actually, a lot of beekeepers have a certain set of colors. So have we all seen the marks of paint on the back of the queen, like this one, this red one? So that's actually to indicate if your beekeeper is doing it right, because some of them kind of just use whiteout and they really shouldn't. There's actually colors that beekeepers use to indicate what year the queen was actually reared in. And so that helps you keep track of how old she is without really having to remember it or write it down anywhere. So I believe last year's color, oh dear, don't quote me, it may have been blue. I don't remember. I didn't get any new queens last year. I think it may have been white, actually. Anyway, there's a roster of colors that we use to keep track of the age. And so, of course, that then helps me realize or remember how old she is. So yeah, I really don't replace every year by any means, but it is indeed probably cap off at 4 years. Some queens in the wild actually have been seen to live past 6, which is incredible.
Pippa wrote in the chat box that white was the color last year.
Yes.
And I was wondering, so where does one find this roster of colors to know how old your queen is?
Right. I'm just checking my belt 1 second. So that should be, I think it is, I could pull it up during our break, actually. I could provide that to you. It should be online. And I think OMAFRA would actually have that as a breakdown, or the Ontario Beekeepers Association website, the OBA, would have that as well. And if you ever get into it, do try to get, I do recommend the Posca if you want to mark your own queens. The Posca paint markers, they're non-toxic. And you should get the medium tip. If you get the thick tip, you kind of end up slopping paint all over the place. And if you get the fine tip, you end up caving in her thorax. So it's not a good idea. Try to get the Posca medium paint marker if you do plan on marking your own queens. If you're in.
Can you bring it closer to the camera, Janine?
You bet.
Okay, that's better.
Yeah, you can get these at any art store.
Oh,
And yeah, the medium tip. So it's nothing. And again, this is the thing about like beekeeper websites and stuff. They love to charge an arm and a leg. It's not a specialty thing. You can just, if you know where to go to get them, you can save a couple bucks for sure.
cool.
Yeah. There's actually really funny, okay, I'll find it on our break. I see people are writing. Is it okay if I carry on? Lovely. So the workers, they're actually all female. As I said, they are able to lay eggs, but they're actually incapable of mating. So the workers have nothing to do with the mating cycle, but they actually still have their own ovaries that allow for egg production. And I'll touch on that a little bit later, because that's getting into more intensive beekeeping, but I'm sure everyone can handle it, and it's really quite fascinating. The workers, however, depends on when they're alive. They go through some significant physiological changes depending on if they're going to be a spring-summer worker or a fall-winter worker. So in the summertime, workers are actually expected more or less to live about 6 weeks. But in the wintertime, it actually needs to be much longer, up to 9 weeks. So it's actually expected of the winter workers to basically survive all winter. And that's actually a significant difference in the proteins that they're fed when they're young larvae during fall time. So the queen will actually stop laying at certain temperature cues in the fall time. And so it is actually expected, the last round of summer workers are expected to rear really healthy winter workers And then those winter workers are expected to keep the hive warm and to keep feeding the queen all throughout the winter. In so much that when the spring breaks, those winter workers actually start rearing the spring workers, and then they begin to die. And it's just an incredible feat, really. And I'll just drop it in here. Certain pollen during the fall time is actually integral to honeybee survival. So pollen from the aster and goldenrod are actually really, really high in protein. And that actually helps build up really plump, healthy winter workers. And it's odd because it's like nature actually knows this already. Nature is giving the bees what they need in order to survive a really long and arduous winter. And it's incredible. So when we're going to be talking about hive location, but when you are actually picking your hive locations, I'm going to say it right now and probably a few more times, make sure that you know what is growing in that location so that your bees actually have the right profiles of food in succession so that they actually do survive or have a chance of surviving a longer winter. I hope that made sense. So it does say here that the bees, the workers don't lay any eggs. They do, but it's actually under kind of funny situations or circumstances. The workers are indeed responsible for all the colony activities. There are undertaker bees. So there are certain kind of genetic roster of workers that are really sensitive to the smell of dead bodies inside the hive, and they will be extra sensitive to that, and they will be undertaker bees. And so they're kind of in charge of making sure that there aren't dead bees in the hive, and that's kind of their job. There are other bees, they're called nurse bees. That's when a worker is fairly young. She'll actually have certain glands in her head that actually make royal jelly, and that's for feeding the baby bees, basically. Workers, as we know, they're the ones who sting. They have the barbed stinger that results actually in death of the worker after they get their stinger in you. Basically, the stinger has the barbs, as I mentioned, to kind of plant it as a flag. It's like sting here, the danger is here, and then you actually have that alarm pheromone that comes out of the stinger, and that's actually how the workers communicate basically how to defend the hive. So again, make sure you get that stinger out as soon as you can, and definitely watch where you wipe it. You can wipe it on your friend if you want them to get stung, but I would recommend not doing that. Okay, and then we have the big boy, the drone. He is the male bee. They live for the summer only. There's really not too many drones per hive. A sign of a healthy hive, actually, there should be around maybe about 1,000 or 2,000, upwards to 3,000 drones per colony. If your colony is all drones, that's actually an indicator of a definite problem. The first problem that it could be is that your queen has actually been poorly mated, and she's actually only laying unfertilized eggs. And then yeah, there's a lot of troubleshooting. I'll get the story of the bee. Just it's hard to know where to drop in at, but maybe I will actually discuss it right now. So let's just briefly, we'll just skip back to the queen. So I mentioned the queen actually is the only one who does all the mating. So she actually has this really specialized organ inside her body. It's called a spermatheca. And when she goes out on her mating flight, she'll go out and she'll meet a congregation of drones. So these drones are kind of all just milling about in this one specific area. And the queen will come flying out and she'll fly through this cloud of drones and they'll all chase her. And they'll kind of basically compete to be able to mate with her mid-air. And so the queen will actually mate with upwards to about 15 different drones. And each drone will actually deposit sperm inside her in the specialized organ called the spermatheca. And so the queen basically gets filled up with sperm of many different kinds of drones. And then before she gets too heavy, actually, with sperm, she actually has to make sure that she can make it back to the hive. So when she makes it back to the hive, fully mated, the workers will accept her, and she'll actually just start basically laying eggs until she can't anymore. So what actually happens there is that the spermatheca is holding all the sperm, and she's got her ovaries, and her ovaries are where her eggs are made. So the queen can actually lay two different kinds of eggs. The first is an unfertilized egg, where the egg will just come from her ovaries, and not actually meet up with any sperm from the spermatheca, and she'll lay an unfertilized egg. So the unfertilized egg yields one kind of bee, and it's the drone bee. So the drone is actually from an unfertilized egg. The drone literally has no father. There's no sperm that's been mixed in. The drone's genetics are just strictly that of the queen. The second kind of egg that the queen can lay is a fertilized egg, where the egg comes from her ovaries and then actually gets passed through with the spermatheca, where sperm from the drones is actually released. The sperm fertilizes that egg inside the queen, and the queen actually lays the fertilized egg. The fertilized egg can yield two different kinds of bees, the worker and the queen. So if you're a male bee, you don't have a dad. You're just straight up your queen's genetics. And then if you are a female bee, a queen or a worker, you actually have a dad, a drone. You've been fertilized, basically. So I will mention right now, the really cool thing about all of this is that it's actually the workers who make the cells. So I'm not sure if you can see my cursor here, but the queen is actually on a cell right here. And I'll talk a little bit about this further on in the presentation. But as the queen is walking through and she's patrolling the hive, she actually sticks her head in. You can watch. She'll stick her head in and she'll measure the size of the cell. And it actually, the size of the cell is what tells her what kind of egg to lay. So further on in this presentation, you'll see the workers will actually build drone cells, which are bigger. So the drone cell is bigger, and as the queen is kind of walking along, she'll measure that bigger cell, and that actually tells her to put an unfertilized egg in the bottom of that cell that then will become a drone. So as she's patrolling along again and she measures that cell, and if it's a normal cell, that actually tells her to lay a fertilized egg, which could then turn into a worker or a queen. I hope that made sense. Is there any questions after I've gone through all of that? Okie dokie.
Hearing none.
All right, I guess that's a good thing. So this is why, essentially too, drones actually have to grow up in a larger cell because they're actually that much bigger. Okay, so it is actually the workers that are building the honeycomb. They decide basically how many drone cells to make that then tells the queen which egg to lay. So as I've discussed, the drones basically are just basically flying bags of sperm. They don't have a stinger. They don't contribute anything really to the colony. They actually need the workers to feed them and clean them. So they're basically incapable of eating or feeding themselves. And actually, the drone dies after mating as well. So in order for him to release his penis and all his sperm, his abdomen basically just needs to explode, and then all the mechanism comes out. He mates with the queen, he passes on the sperm to her, and then he falls to the ground dead. And for the drones that actually don't successfully mate, end up dying anyway. The workers, as the fall starts to approach, and then of course the flowers start to be less and less populous, so the less food there is, the workers will actually start to kick the drones out of the hive, where they either freeze or starve to death. So it's the life of the drone is pretty straightforward, pretty simple, and knowing that they don't have a stinger, you can actually always pretend or practice picking up bees by just picking up your drones if you want. When I take my nieces out beekeeping with me, I always pass them the drones and they just love playing with them. Okay. What do we have for time-wise? I usually like to take breaks. I think we're rounding the corner of an hour. Well, not quite. Okay, I'm just going to continue. Please stop if you have any questions or if you need me to reiterate something that perhaps hasn't made sense. So here, again, when you are opening up your hive and actually checking on how things are going, if you actually have what's called a queen right colony, or your queen is present, you should be able to see eggs at the bottom of the cell. And actually, ideally for proper development, these eggs need to be at the bottom in the center. If you see eggs up on the side of the cell, that means your queen's probably not properly mated, or you actually have laying workers. The reason why you might have laying workers is because their abdomens are too short and they're laying eggs in the cell, but obviously can't reach to the bottom. So if you see eggs on the side of your cells or not in the center, that means that you have a laying issue and your queen may have run out of sperm, right? Because that does happen. And when your queen runs out of sperm, which means she's not laying fertilized eggs anymore, that means the population of workers is going to start to drop because workers are from fertilized eggs. And if she is only laying unfertilized eggs, that means the population of drones are going to start going up. Here you have the larva. So there's basically 4 stages to honeybee development. The first one is the egg here. You have your larva here, and they're kind of like, they should be like juicy white, kind of in a puddle of what's called bee bread. That's basically goo that nurse bees make. It's a mixture of pollen and honey and proteins again. And so it's this goo that the larvae basically eat while they're developing. And then you have your pupa here. So you can see here that's underneath this lettering. Sorry, I got this from the internet. But the reason why there's food deposited with the larva is that that's actually the food that the larva needs to basically develop into. It's basically their resources to spend growing on inside their cells. You can see that the cell's actually capped over at the top here. So that's the pupa developing. Sorry, the cell, this is the pupa, pardon me. The pupa is on the right, and then the adult here is on the left. So here's the pupa, this is after the larva. So the pupa has been consuming this bee bread the whole time, and it's actually been developing into a pupa. And you can see that the wing buds have started to form. Their eyes are turning purple, and they're basically graduating into what is then a ready adult bee. And so when you actually get to see the adult, in this case, it's an adult worker, she'll chew her way out of the wax cell at the top here, and she'll just be a fresh new baby bee, and she'll just get straight to work. So it's quite miraculous, really, to watch them hatch. I still act like I've seen, whenever I see a worker hatching, I still get really excited. It's like the first time that I've seen it, because it's just so adorable. Any questions about the development of the bees from egg, larva, pupa, and adult? We're all good? So, whoopsie, skipped one. So I have touched upon this before. There are differences in cell sizes. So here's what's considered a worker cell. And this is where you can actually find the workers, the fertilized eggs that the queen will lay, and they'll turn into workers. This is actually where you'll find most of the what's called brood production. So if you hear the word brood, that means the egg, larva, pupa, and then of course the adult. And that's just where the baby bees are, is what it is. This is actually also for pollen and nectar storage. And then of course the nectar gets turned into honey. Down here, as I mentioned, are the drone cells. So you can see that the cell size itself is actually bigger. And that's then to be able to have enough room for the bigger drone to grow up in. And again, as I mentioned, it's the workers who actually make these cells, in so much that then the workers kind of tell the queen which egg to lay. Down here is a drone being born. And you can see in this case, some of the cells are bigger, but what's happened, and this is again, training your eye as a beekeeper to be able to spot the problem, is that you can see that these cells are actually kind of bubbled out. It means that the queen has actually laid an unfertilized egg or a drone egg inside a normal sized cell. And the poor drones are getting squished into this tiny little space, and they end up not being able to develop properly. But if you actually, again, have a queen that's laying unfertilized eggs, that actually means that she's either run out of sperm, she's poorly mated, and likely needs to be replaced before it's too late. In the lower right-hand corner here, you actually have what's called a queen cell. And so this, as you can see, is basically the workers have built this queen cell off of a normal worker cell. And then they've basically built this kind of like what is often called like a peanut kind of shape that then hangs out and off. That's for proper air circulation, but it's actually also to accommodate the space that the biggest bee inside the hive, which is the queen, needs in order to grow properly. So again, it's just all about space. And yeah, you should be able to basically see the difference between what a worker cell looks like, a drone cell, and then a queen cell. Because as we've explained, or as I've explained, if you were to kind of pop off that wax cap, you'd be able to see the pupa developing underneath. So again, what makes a queen bee? Basically, as I mentioned, the queen has the two kinds of eggs, the fertilized and unfertilized. So first of all, you need to start with a fertilized egg. So basically the queen and the worker kind of start out at the same kind of rate or pace, but the difference between a queen bee and a worker bee is the actual larva. For a queen larva, or that's to be determined to be a queen larva, is the feeding of royal jelly. And I'm sure everyone here has actually heard of royal jelly and what it may be. I've tried it. It tastes kind of like really sour yogurt. I wouldn't recommend eating too much of it because it's kind of gross, but it's always interesting to be able to say that you've eaten some. Anyway, so the nurse bees actually have these special glands inside their head that are capable of making royal jelly. So it's a special bee secretion, and it's really high in protein and kind of different enzymes basically that kind of makes the larva then not a worker larva, but then turn into a queen bee larva. And again, that whole kind of scientific physiological process is just mind-blowing. It's absolutely amazing. And then of course, with the deposit of the royal jelly at the base of the cell, that is then for the larva to eat, become a queen, and then basically we go from there. She hatches as a queen bee, and then the workers basically make sure as a virgin that she's well taken care of. The virgin queen then leaves, goes on her mating flight, fills up her spermatheca, comes back, and is the queen. Any questions about this? Groovy. So I think, when was I planning? Oh, would anyone like a break actually right now? Kind of halfway through? If we're all okay, I believe this is where I kind of shift into talking about, bee equipment basically.
Janine, were you thinking, I know originally when we were supposed to be in person, we were talking 1 till 4. Are we thinking 1 till 3 now that we're on a webinar?
I think, well, that would be then another hour and 10. I would like to actually make sure that we have enough time for everyone to ask questions and discuss things.
Cool.
I would say I'm about a third of the way through the presentation, but I think the equipment part will probably go pretty quickly. I believe we could probably go until 3:30 or 4 though, if everyone wanted.
Well, it will be recorded, so maybe people can stick with us as long as they can, and you can also watch the recording as well. So, and yeah, we typically aren't taking breaks in our other 2-hour webinars, so you can choose what you want to do.
Fabulous. I'm actually okay. I don't need a break just yet. This is a fabulous poster. I try to put it up everywhere. It does kind of pertain to us beekeepers in the north. So this is kind of just a really beautiful rendition of what a beekeeper's year looks like. So where we're at right now, January and February, is your time to kind of brush up and plan for the spring. It's your opportunity to either build or fix equipment. In March, you can actually start maybe taking peeks at the hive. March is actually, again, where the queen, due to temperature cues and light cues, the queen actually does start laying her eggs again. And that's actually a really crucial time. So there's kind of 2 pivotal times in the beekeeper's year where things can like happen really fast. And when I mean things, I mean colony death. So your bees, I would say there's maybe 2 kind of crucial pivotal times. The first one would be in March, where the colony has actually survived the winter, but then may or may not need an actual boost of food usually. So it's March, and then I would say October is actually your other crucial time. So it's when they're going into the winter and then coming out of the winter is when your job as a beekeeper has really never basically been more important. So in March, and again, we just have to cross our fingers most of the time. And it's all actually really like weather dependent. So in March, you definitely need to be sure that you actually have some extra bee feed or sugar syrup at the ready to be able to feed your bees in an emergency, because they honestly can starve to death in about 3 days. And if you don't catch them, you'll just lose them all, even after surviving the winter. And it's devastating. I've seen it happen way too many times, but it does happen. And then, of course, in October, that's when the feeding becomes really important as well, because they need to stock up on their reserves to actually be able to survive the winter. For a single brood chamber, you would actually have to expect about 40 pounds of food to be able, you have to give your bees basically about 40 pounds of food in order to expect that single brood chamber to survive the winter. And then, of course, in March, again, it all depends on the weather. Like the willow could be blooming, there could be pollen coming in hand over fist. There could be lots of like snowdrops and crocuses in bloom, and there's tons of nectar going on. And then, of course, like the spring that we actually had last year, it was devastating. There was not only a drought, I'm not sure if everyone remembers, because as a beekeeper, I remember really bad years. 2009 was a horrible year. I don't know why I'm laughing, but the last spring was horrible because we actually experienced a drought and then a frost. Does everyone remember that? It was nuts. Like a lot of crops actually failed. And I was just honestly, basically, I had my fingers crossed that the same thing weren't happening to the bees, but I rarely have to feed in the spring. And I was feeding like nobody's business in the springtime. One thing to actually notice is when the bees are actually on the brink of starvation, they become really lethargic and they really aren't quite able to move very well, nor can they fly because they're literally starving to death. So if you open up your hive and there's a lot of bees, you're like, oh, great, like they've all survived, but they're actually not flying and they're kind of just like sloughing off. Like if you pick up a frame and they're kind of just like falling and dropping, that's actually meaning that you've got probably less than 2 days to feed them because they're starving to death. So that's a really good sign to look out for in the spring. In April, if you've kind of gotten over that kind of crucial moment and they're kind of clipping along, and again, the weather is actually cooperating, basically, without really even actually having to look at your hive, what you can do is you can look out and see what else is in bloom around. So again, I know the apple blossoms up where I live provide a lot of food for the bees basically in early May when they start, or late April, early May. It's usually late April, again, weather dependent. And then of course the dandelions start popping out. So it's basically, you can kind of tell how fast your bees are going to start expanding their population and rebounding from the winter based on how much food there is available, right? So how many literally blossoms, how many flowering things that you see are definitely what the bees are going to be bringing in. So if there's a whole field of dandelion just going for it, you can expect then your bee numbers to be increasing. And then that's actually where here in May, you actually have to start watching out for swarming. Because of course, bees, as they want to basically propagate or like kind of divide and conquer and be out in the environment, that's what swarming is. So bees will swarm in order to basically propagate themselves. Really, they'll swarm, they'll leave the nest behind, and they'll actually go out and start a new one. So May is basically when the swarming happens, and that's actually because usually by then the weather has basically leveled out and there's a lot of things in bloom. It's warm enough for the bees to actually swarm and all these things. So May is definitely the keep your peepers peeled for all these swarm cells that's in this circle here. And then in June, after the swarming kind of mayhem has kind of subsided, you can actually basically start considering, you can do it in May as well, but doing splits. So you can start splitting your hives. Actually doing splits in May is also a really good way of preventing swarming as well, because you just, again, you're splitting the numbers, you're making more space, and that actually then kind of reverses the want for the bees to start to swarm anyway. One of the problems in Ontario, however, is that if you're going to split in May, you either actually have to let the bees rear their own queen, because a lot of beekeepers in Ontario, their queens aren't ready until June. So there is a bit of like a, not a mismatch in timing, but there is a bit of a juggling act that you actually have to be mindful of. So I would say as a beekeeper, some of the busiest times as a beekeeper are going to be the months of May and June. Like you're just going to be hopping. And again, the bees are very forgiving during these months as well. So if, say, you accidentally squish the queen if you're doing an inspection or something, the bees tend to be able to really rebound because of all the heat and the resources that are made available to them. July quite often is just spent supering. So again, if your neighbor, one time, oh, my eyeballs almost fell out of my head. My neighbor actually put in a whole, I don't even know how many acres, but it was canola as far as the eye can see. And I was like, oh no, because I actually don't like canola honey very much, but I knew that the bees were just going to be bringing in canola, canola, canola. And I'll mention right now, bees can actually navigate about 3 to 3.5 kilometers away. So when you're driving around, always be looking like what's growing kind of near your house as well, because they'll be bringing that in. And so, yeah, my neighbor had put in so much canola. And honestly, I run medium supers. So there's basically 3 different kinds of supers that you can use. There's the deep super, which is the same size as the brood chamber, your medium, and then your shallow super. I run mediums because they don't get too heavy. They're basically kind of at the limit of what I would like to lift and not ruin my back for. So again, when the neighbor had the canola honey in, I was actually putting 3 supers on at a time, and the bees were just filling it like over and over. If you actually don't if you don't give the bees empty super space and they just are bringing in the nectar, that's actually when swarming can happen again. So again, the cues for swarming essentially is when the population of the colony becomes too dense. And when there's too many bees in one space at one time, basically the bees can't smell the presence of their queen. And that actually is what triggers them to start the swarming process. So in that sense, and if you can remember, if you want to prevent swarming, you can either split their numbers and actually give each hive their new queen, or you can continue adding space, because the more space you add, the more that those bees can spread out. And so they're not packed in there like little sardines. You can spread them out, and then it actually lets the smell of the queen basically flow through the hive. The bees can smell that the queen is there, and then that actually doesn't trigger them to start swarming. So in July, again, if you've got a huge nectar flow, make sure that you give them enough space, because then they can actually just end up swarming on you. And as I said, a swarm in July is not worth a fly. And that's because essentially it takes a lot of resources and time, and really only really the month of August for that new colony to rebound, build up their numbers before winter starts coming, right? And so that's actually where the timing of your swarming, again, a swarm in August, probably guaranteed to really not be able to survive the winter if you don't boost their numbers and their food. So August is, any questions then for half the year from January to July?
Remember, if you have a question, you need to unmute and then pose your question, or you can put it in the chat box and I can read it to Janine.
Okay, so moving into August, essentially is kind of a bit of a juggling act, because when you take your supers off, you actually want to make sure that your honey is ripe. Now, what is ripe honey? Basically, when honey has reached, the bees collect nectar and actually add their own enzymes, again, from these glands in their head. They actually add their own enzymes, and then they remove the humidity. So what bees do, they actually dehydrate the nectar to a certain point. It's usually 16% relative humidity. And then they actually add enzymes to the nectar, and that transforms it into honey, which is basically just 2 sugar molecules, glucose and fructose. And then, of course, with a whole lot of flavor, depending on the nectar source. So when bees actually consider the honey to be ripe, they'll actually put a wax cap on it. And that keeps it kind of fresh. It keeps basically any excess moisture out, because honey is, it's called hygroscopic. So honey actually likes to absorb water or moisture from the air. And when that happens, when honey basically gets too wet, it starts to ferment. So ripe honey is that the bees have actually capped over with beeswax. So in August, you can feel free to start taking your supers away, and you can start extracting. What's really wonderful too, I actually have different colored supers, and I can kind of keep track of what honey and what nectar came from what time of the year. So if my supers, say, are orange and I put them on in May, I'm almost doubly sure that that's actually apple blossom honey. which is really cool. And you can actually kind of smell the difference between the honeys too when you're extracting it. So you can start taking some of the ripened honey out, but it is definitely really important that when you're basically taking the supers off, that you're not actually taking off too much uncapped honey, because that can spoil basically your whole honey crop, right, through the fermentation. Into September then, you are actually in the honey house churning away. Quite often it's actually really hot. So you're extracting honey and sweating your tuchus off, which is always great. And then in October, you then have to make sure that you either leave the bees with some of their own honey, which is what I do, or you actually feed them. This is when, of course, is really imperative timing to actually treat and medicate your hives for any issues that you may find. I'll be talking about bee diseases and pests as well, a little bit further down. So yeah, it's basically, if you take it away, you have to return it. Again, for a single hive, it would be about 40 pounds of food. For me, the way I do it, because I'm not a commercial beekeeper and honey isn't my money, I actually leave the bees with their own super of honey. And that's actually well over 40 pounds. So I have specialty marked supers. They have a big W on them. It's for winter. And that's actually their food. There's winter supers that I leave on, and that's their food for the winter, instead of me giving them the sugar syrup. But you ask 5 beekeepers how to do one thing and you get 10 different answers. So what I'm saying is that it's not my way or the highway. We just all have our different ways of doing things. And so, of course, in October, that's when you feed and you treat for any ailments that you may have detected. And then, of course, November and December is when you wrap them up and you say sayonara for the spring, until the spring rather, and you just honestly hope for the best. And here, at least here in Ontario and North America, there are just really, really important kind of, I know you guys probably can't see this, but there's apple blossom. These are really important plants that bees are essential for bee survival. So early spring bloomers like dandelion, we have our crocus here, and then of course pussy willow. So any willow is really good early pollen source for the bees. And again, pollen is actually needed to start rearing that spring brood, the larvae, because the larvae really need their pollen to survive and to develop. And then we actually have our apple blossoms. I believe that is what it looks like, raspberry. Basswood trees are so lovely. They're some of the loveliest honey plants you could ever ask for. And then, of course, we have our, I believe, what would that be? Poplar. Borage never hurts. You have your alfalfas and your clovers. You have your sunflowers and some fireweed. Up here we have our goldenrod. Asters, thistles, definitely. And there are actually, I have a list of more plants that are really beneficial to bees at the end of the presentation as well.
Janine, Judy asked, do you have single or double hives?
So again, that's kind of personal preference. I find that basically I was used to running single hives when I worked at the University of Guelph Honeybee Research Center. They're a lot easier to manage because what I find with a double is that the double brood chamber, like this guy here, they tend to get basically just stuck right together. They quite often they're not actually as fun to work with. Like if you're a new beekeeper, they're really hard to basically kind of work. And if you wanted to find the queen, or if you wanted to do swarm patrol or swarm control, you actually have to pry this really big heavy box off. You have to set it down. There's kind of bees everywhere. So there's the positive and negatives to running singles or running doubles. I will say that doubles, you end up, and this isn't the gospel by any means, doubles tend to survive the winter a little bit better. Singles, you have to kind of baby. You really have to make sure that the singles are ready for the winter. But then again, I find singles just a lot easier to kind of manage. And then of course your doubles tend to bring in double the amount of honey as well. So it kind of depends on what you're after.
Judy, did you want to add any more to that question?
No, that sounds good.
Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can talk you through if we have some more time. If you've got any questions about which one you'd like to do, I can ask you a few more questions about what you're hoping to do too.
And Janine,
Okay.
Pippa asks, where can we get a copy of the Beekeeper's Year?
Yeah. So I believe Innisfil Honey has these posters for sale, and so does Propolis, etc. down in Guelph. It's a gorgeous artist rendition, and of course, there's a lot of text here that we can't read, but it basically explains what I've already been blathering about.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So again, I'm just going to say 3 hours, 5 hours isn't going to cover all the things that I could probably just sit here and continue talking about. But there are definitely some things that we can just kind of touch on. For the hardcores, a lot of people really don't care. I actually don't care about this either, but if you ever get corrected by a hardcore beekeeper, the term colony actually indicates the hive and the bees together. So like, I guess it's kind of appropriate too, if honeybees are indeed the white man's fly, it might just be more than appropriate that they're called colonies. I'm not sure if that was on purpose. Anyway, and then of course a hive is the hive body. So it's basically the box without the bees. And that's getting a little bit technical, but that is actually how those two terms are differentiated. And then this is basically kind of the rundown of what the hive body looks like. And I actually have all the equipment here as well. So I'm going to get up for a second. And as you can see, just kind of getting used to the terminology is the first kind of step. So I remember when I first started out at the bee lab, my boss, Paul Kelly, he'd be like, well, go get some queen excluders. And I'm like, come again? What are you talking about? Or like, go get the bottom board. Well, the bottom board's pretty good. Anyway, here we have what looks like a double brood chamber. So the brood chamber is basically the regular sized box. And I have one here. So you can see the brood chamber itself is a fairly large box. It should actually, and again, it depends on who you're talking to, but the brood chamber should actually have 10 frames. A lot of people like to keep their bees with 9 frames in their brood chamber. So this can actually hold 10 or 9 frames. What is actually also really good is that there's some galvanized steel that reinforces where the frames sit. And actually it's really nice too, if you're a hobby beekeeper, to actually paint your colonies in different colors. So bees can't see red or black. So I wouldn't actually wear red or black clothes in the bee yard, nor would I paint my bee boxes red or black. So here, and actually when you make the colors of your brood chambers different, that actually helps the workers be able to find their house a lot faster. Because again, bees really do use color to not only distinguish between flowers, but between their boxes where they live. So say if you have a row of like 5, I would say like try to mix up the colors, because if you're a worker bee coming back home and all your boxes are green, they're gonna maybe drift a little bit. They might go into the wrong hive, they might fight, whatever. Bees actually also can recognize patterns and shapes. So if your boxes are all the same colors, you can put a hashtag on the front of one, you can put a spiral or a triangle on the front of the other one. And again, that just helps the foraging workers rather, to find their home a lot faster, because bees are actually pretty smart. So what I've done here, and kind of just to save time, you can see that the one brood chamber actually has an orange face and then just white body. So instead of spending a lot on paint, you can actually just paint the front. And that will do the trick. You don't have to paint the whole box either. So first things first, when you're setting up your beehive, you want actually to get the bees about a couple feet up off the ground. So that actually helps keep the ants away. So it's generally called a hive stand. That's one thing that's kind of, missing from this diagram, is you want the bees to be about 1/2 meter up off the ground. And again, that just kind of keeps the mice from going in. It keeps them obviously out of any water. If there's a lot of rain or something, it just basically keeps the hive up and out of the way of floods or intense snow. Okay, and then yeah, you have your hive stand, and then you actually have your bottom board. And there are two ways that the bottom board can go. There's kind of this, here's the back here. You can kind of see that my bottom board here actually has, is on some cleats already. I'm not sure if I'm holding it properly, but here are the cleats. So as it sits, you actually still have a bit of a gap from the hive stand at the bottom to where the actual bees can come in and out of. So here's the cutaway, so that when, here, let's see if I can do this. So make sure that you create an entrance. So here is where your bees, this will be basically the front of your hive, so that when you put your box down and you line everything up, you actually have the gap here. So that's where your bees will come in and out of, basically. I actually always recommend, I do recommend putting your bees on a hive stand. And then of course, always be mindful of the tilt of your hive stand, or feel free to actually shim your bottom board. It's always really good to give your colony or your hive body a little bit of a tilt, in so much that if you have crazy winds and rains, if the beehive is tilted back, then you're actually going to start collecting a lot of water inside the hive. And that actually makes the bees, it's a detriment to the bees. The bees do not like wet feet or what is called like a flooded basement. So always do try to pitch your colony forward to allow drainage of, of any water that gets in there, condensation from the winter, or any snow that may accumulate. So that's a really good first tip for first and foremost.
Janine, what does a bee stand look like? Is it just made out of wood as well?
Again, you can spend $50 buying a bee stand at a bee store. What I do is I actually take 2 wooden pallets that are destined for the garbage or just out at the hardware store. 2 pallets stacked on top of each other does the trick.
Okay.
Yep. And just try to make sure that, again, your hive stand is relatively level. I would actually recommend shimming the hive body instead of the actual bee stand. Because again, if you think some summers, you can actually have a tower of supers. And if your hive stand is pitched too far forward, your supers could actually fall over. So yeah, just try to make sure your hive stand is level, and then actually maybe shim the hive body instead, just to make sure it's got that pitch forward.
Great, thank you.
No worries. Any questions so far? Good. So this is our brood chamber. You actually have 9 or 10 frames. I couldn't get my frames out of storage today. I keep my frames in Tupperwares out in my shed that actually freeze, because I keep my frames away from mice and wax moth during the winter. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So I would have frames in here to show you, but I've actually packed them away. Usually next up, so this is your single brood chamber. A double brood chamber obviously just has another box on top. Your next piece of equipment, so say the bees are really starting to bring in honey and it's time for you to put your super on. I'll be moving into here, what is the queen excluder. So the queen excluder is here. And there are actually 2 kinds. The first is a plastic queen excluder. So you can kind of see it's basically just a grill. I wouldn't recommend making your own. I would recommend actually getting these from the beekeeping store. What they do actually is these are certain holes of a specific width that actually let the worker bees up through, but actually excludes the queen from getting up into your supers, because you don't want the queen laying eggs in your honey. So you have the plastic ones. I'll say that while they're light, the plastic ones are light, they really don't survive very long. They get really brittle and kind of crappy as they age. I actually really like the hardy and sturdy metal ones. You can always actually weld your metal ones back together if they get broken. That's another thing too, is that if you're using plastic queen excluders and one of them cracks and breaks, your queen will find that hole and she'll go up into your supers and just start laying eggs in your honey, which is not desired. And then these just become garbage. Sometimes you don't see that there's a break in them as well. And then, yeah, you just have eggs everywhere. One really nice thing too about the metal queen excluders is that I can take a blowtorch and I can actually just melt what is this propolis. The bees like to plug up any extra spaces and gaps with propolis. You can kind of see it there. And then my little propane torch honestly just melts this all away, and it's actually really easy to clean, unlike the plastic ones as well. So you put your queen excluder down, and this is probably likely in and around the month of May when you're trying to prevent swarming and start collecting honey.
Hey, Janine, Pippa's saying she could get some frames if you want people to see them. Is that a pain, Pippa? Like, where are they close by?
They're just out in my garage. I can grab them out of my Tupperware box.
Smart. If you
have a look at a frame.
If you have a brood frame and a honey frame, that'd be excellent.
Okie dokie.
Thank you.
You carry on.
Okay, so here's my medium super. And again, I don't have any frames, but I would put 9 frames, or sometimes beekeepers have 8 frames or 9 frames. I prefer 9 frames in my super. And
why, Janine?
So basically when the bees come in and when the honey is ripe and they cap the honey, so this is, I'm not sure if you can see my hand, this is the frame, but the capped honey actually kind of puckers out a little bit. So it sticks out well past the frame. Now that's actually really good when it comes time for uncapping, when you're extracting your honey. But you actually want to make sure that the bees don't go too crazy and start building basically honey in between your frames, because that can make a horrible mess. So I would say 9. Sometimes people do 8. But yeah, 8 sometimes gets kind of messy. And yeah, the bees will start actually building comb in between your honey frames, and that ends up being a bit of a waste, and you get less honey that way. One thing that's really important too, I'm not sure if you can see, these, you don't have to, but these honey supers actually have frame spacers. So when you're carrying your honey, it actually keeps the frames basically from sticking together and from knocking around when you're carrying it. So this actually has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 spacers. So this is an 8 frame super, which means that I'd probably be using this last, or maybe as a winter super is probably what I've actually been using it for. So there's been many occasions actually, when I've been working at the University of Guelph Bee Lab, we've actually had stacks of beehives that are actually 11 to 12 supers high. That's how much honey's come in. It's a lot of honey. Each of these medium supers you could expect to weigh about 50 to 60 pounds. If you're using a deep super, so a deep super would indeed be the same size as your brood chamber, which is actually that much bigger. Those can get up to 90 pounds. And so sometimes if you're not into weightlifting and stuff, you may be mindful. If you actually find that your super is too heavy, don't be afraid. Just bring another empty box with you, take some of the frames out, and don't break your back. Just carry more boxes. Just lighten the load a little bit, right? Do yourself a favor.
Pippa, do you have those frames? Oops, you're muted.
All I could find was one of the honey super frames. So this is from a small box. And you can see it's got, little things here that hold on to the side. And then the bees sort of make their wax. You can see a little wax at the top.
Yeah.
Fill them in with honey. And it's, two-sided. So they're the same.
Perfect. And that's a plastic foundation, yeah?
Yes, I believe so.
Good stuff. Very good. Thank you.
That's a short one.
And not backbreaking. And you said you couldn't find any brood frames?
No, the brood frames are all out in the hive.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, so we're going to have to just...
But they're the same, except they're 6 inches longer.
That's right. Yeah, so here, it's actually in this diagram here. You can see that these shallow supers, the frames are indeed basically built to fit the size of the box, where your brood chambers and your brood frames will be the size, a full, basically frame size, yeah. And they're pretty darn heavy too. So you have your honey supers. And again, as I mentioned at the bee lab, sometimes it'd be 11 to 12 high. It was madness, but that's a good thing. It's a good problem to have. Oh, and actually, if you're starting out, I've always been telling people this, if you're starting out, I think the minimum amount of frames that you should, the minimum amount of honey supers you should have ready per hive is a minimum of 5, because you don't know what kind of nectar flow you're going to get, but you should have at least 5 per hive on hand. 5 per colony, but 5 per hive rhymes, so it's easier to remember. So when we are basically assembling our hive, hold on here, just trying to get more space here. I'm just going to shove my little operation back. Okay, so you've got your tower. People wouldn't think that the inner cover is an important piece of equipment. So it's here, the inner cover at the top. It's actually really important. And if you're going out and you're shopping for your inner cover, I highly recommend that you get one with the ventilation hole in the center here, and actually the notch in the front. This is what's called an upper entrance. So when you're buying your inner covers, try to get this kind. You'll thank me later, but I'll explain to you why. So can everyone see that little notch at the top here? It's right here. And that actually is essentially to provide ventilation for the beehive. So here you've got your lower entrance, or your complete entrance here, and then you actually do have your upper entrance here. And that actually enables the bees to manage a circular ventilation system. So ventilation is crucial to honeybee survival. Believe it or not, bees as insects actually need oxygen just as much as we do. And if they can't get the proper ventilation, they can actually get really sick. A lot of fungus can start growing, and they can kind of actually almost suffocate to death in the wintertime as well. So make sure you get your inner covers with an upper entrance. This hole actually is also really advantageous for emergency feeding or bucket feeding as well, either in the spring or in the fall. And the nice thing too is if, say you're introducing a nucleus colony to their larger brood chamber, you can always actually turn this upper entrance off by flipping it over, right? That's actually where I say turning it on or off. So you can turn the upper entrance off by flipping it over. And then of course your final piece is the lid. And that's actually what turns the upper entrance off, because that gap is pressing up against the lid and the bees can't get in. So I like heavy lids with galvanized steel, or aluminum rather, on top. A metal sheet basically. And that actually just helps to insulate your hive. The lid is heavy so that it won't come flying off in the wind. And yeah, it should be of a lighter color. You really don't want any darker metals, like any blacks or anything, because that will actually make the colony way too hot in the summertime. Any questions about this setup? I know it's kind of hard to see, but you have your bottom board with your entrance. You have your queen excluder, always between your brood chamber and your super. You have your inner cover and your lid. So that's kind of the basic setup that's also in this diagram. One thing that I was trained to do actually as a beekeeper, always keep ergonomics in mind. You do not want to destroy your back. If you talk to older beekeepers, you'll be lucky to find one with a back that's still intact. So when you're lifting or carrying a beehive, obviously carry it from behind, and always don't twist, but actually move, okay? Move with the box. Don't ever twist with the weight, especially with your honey supers. It's one surefire way to destroy your back. I do have, actually, okay, hold on. Because we're just coming out of it, what I'm going to do, right. This is actually, sorry, I should have kept it there. This is quite the important thing to actually mention. Okay, as long as everyone can see. So, I'm just putting the setup back. I kind of just want to make this a little bit better so that everyone can actually see what I'm doing. It's getting a little silly. So
Jack and Linda mentioned, Janine, that they put a rock on top of the outer cover.
oh yes, yeah, that rock or bricks or something, yeah, as well, to keep it from flying off basically in the wintertime.
And I remember Hugh Simpson saying something about he puts a rock in a different location to say something about the personality of the hive or whatever.
Oh, it's totally true. You can basically start with your own, like you can actually start up like your own coding system. If you have a brick and it's like on its side, that can mean that you've just requeened or like do not open. Like it's, yeah, you can kind of start setting up your own, basically like rock language if you wanted. I just wanted to show everyone from this perspective, basically what kind of like your generic overwintering situation looks like or what you might be coming out of. Can everyone see the setup all right? Because it was kind of the other.
I think so.
Yeah. The other way that I had it was like way too close up. Okay. So this is basically, yeah, a couple supers high. You are now about to take your honey off. There are multiple ways of actually getting your honey supers free of bees. My favorite one is what's called a bee escape. Has anyone seen this piece of equipment before? These bee escapes, I would say, are really probably the most humane method as well to get the bees out of the honey super before you bring it in for extraction. A lot of commercial beekeepers use leaf blowers, and that's okay. Some of the beekeepers in the past actually would use cyanide, like they would poison the bees, which to me didn't make any sense. So at least we've kind of gotten away from that. So this is a bee escape. And what it is it's basically a one-way maze for the bees to get through, but then actually prohibits the bees from getting up into. So what the bee escape does, you always put your bee escape on underneath the supers that you want to be emptied of bees. So this super is full of honey, but it's also full of bees. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use the bee escape. Essentially, you have to put it triangle side down, because what happens is that the bees actually have only one way to get out of the hive, and it would be through the lower entrance. So the bees are actually in the super. Your upper entrance hole is off, right? Like you want, whenever you have honey supers on, the upper hole would be switched to off, because you don't want the bees coming in to rob the hive or the honey. And of course, you don't want the bees using the upper entrance during that time either. So yeah, you have your upper entrance turned off. And then, yeah, this is full of bees. So basically you have to put it triangle side down. So then the bees actually come through this hole here, and they actually have 1, 2, 3 points to get out. So each point of the triangle actually has an opening. So the bees walk through this maze, they find their way out, but because the smell of honey at this hole here attracts them so much, they actually forget that the holes are here, here, and here, which means they actually can't really find their way back up through the maze, which means that in about the span of no more than 3 days, should you leave your bee escape on, You put your bee escape here. You put your full super with bees on top. You switch your upper entrance to off, because then if you don't do that, your bee escape's not going to work. Okay, you leave that on for about 3 days. If it's rainy for those 3 days, you might want to expect it to have to stay on a little bit more, because the bees aren't actually going to want to leave if it's been raining, right? Because they know that they can't go outside. But if it's been really warm and nice, the bees will of course be wanting to get out. So about 3 days later, you can come along and you can take these off. And then you can pretty much just walk away with your box of honey and no bees. I always recommend actually bringing some extra lids, because when you're extracting your honey, you want to keep the bees from accessing it. So always try to keep your frames and your supers kind of locked down when you're collecting, when you're removing the honey. You want to keep the bees away, because they'll just basically fly right back into your boxes if you're just leaving them on the lawn or in your truck. So always try to kind of lock them up. Then you can leave your bee escape up, standing up for a little bit. If there are any bees stuck in the triangle, they'll actually move upwards and out. And then, yeah, you can just tuck that away for next time. And then we can talk just briefly about overwintering.
Janine,
yes.
Judy asks if you mentioned the reducers.
Right, and that is typically used in overwintering. So I'm about to be heading there.
Perfect.
Yeah. So we've taken our honey off. So that super's gone. Always do try to remember to take your queen excluder off when you're overwintering. This is metal. So it's basically like you're trying to survive the winter with a metal grill that's really waking away. It's conducting a lot of the heat away from the hive. So make sure that this metal grill is gone. So what we have here is then, yeah, we're going to start overwintering. So what I really like to do, and what I try to make sure of, is you have your entrance reducers. So these basically are just pieces of wood. If you actually do woodworking yourself, you can make these no problem. They serve basically two purposes. The first one is to essentially do what their name is to reduce the entrance. So it actually just makes less cold air basically available to be lost through the hive. So here, so basically just, yeah, it kind of stops such a big gap for all the cold air to come in. But what it actually also should do is that this is literally the height of a mouse's skull. So if you're making your own entrance reducers, make sure that this is actually, I believe, what is it, 1/3 of an inch? Something like that, don't quote me. Look it up, maybe again, I used to know it. But make sure it's actually the appropriate height, because if it again is too big, you'll just invite mice in. And if mice get into your hives, you can say bye-bye, because the mice will eat the honey stores, disturb the bees enough that it will just basically bother them all winter. And usually with bees that have mice inside the hive, they tend to die over the winter anyway. So you have your entrance reducer here. And what I do is I cut pieces of pink styrofoam. So here, this stuff is really nice because it actually lasts forever. The bees don't really chew it very much. And yeah, it's actually a really good insulator. They're really easy to stack, and of course they're really light. So what I do is actually also really important is I open the upper entrance for overwintering. So again, that actually allows for the circular flow of air, even in the winter. And if you think about it too, if on a nice day, the sun is shining, but the snow is actually up and over your front entrance here, you still want the bees to be able to go out for their cleansing flight. So bees actually don't defecate inside the hive. They hold it basically until they have the opportunity to go. And so on a nice sunny, warmish winter day, you'll see bees coming out for a cleansing flight. That's actually just, yeah, where they come out and get the chance to poo, basically, but they wouldn't be able to actually leave the hive if this lower entrance is blocked with snow. And this is where the upper entrance literally saves the day most of the time. So yeah, make sure you have your upper entrance. And then, so your upper entrance is open. Your pieces of styrofoam are then cut to fit the inner cover. And then it depends on your preference. But I actually have these black, they're corrugated black plastic. And these are called Wellington Winter Wraps. And you can get them through the Ontario Beekeepers Association. So what you do is you slide the wrap over. And this is another important part. Here, make sure your wrap is not covering the lower entrance. Okay, and that's where part and parcel of your bottom board would actually stop the wrap. But then what I've actually had to do manually is I've cut a square into the black wrap to actually match the upper inner cover hole, the upper entrance, basically, to make sure that the bees can come out. And you take your lid and you fit it on. And then this is where the rock or the bricks become really important, because quite often the actual lids don't fit over the wrap perfectly, but then your rocks and your bricks will actually help keep this lid in place, because you definitely don't want those lids going flying in the middle of winter.
Janine, a question from Judy. She uses the reducer when she introduces the nuke. Is this necessary?
Yes, that actually wouldn't do any harm, because again, what the entrance reducer does is it actually keeps, if you've introduced your nuke, that's obviously not a full-sized hive. So you actually want to make sure that those bees that maybe aren't as populated can defend a smaller entrance. So that's actually a really good call. But be sure that when you're, say, because a nuke is usually either 3 or 4 frames, when you're up to about 6 or 7 frames of bees, you probably won't need that entrance reducer anymore, because the numbers have gotten populous enough that the bees can actually defend the entrance on their own.
And a few of our attendees don't have bees, and I'm looking at this diagram of all these pieces of, what would make up a hive. How much money would it cost to set up one hive like this, approximately?
Right, I just have to plug in my computer, one sec. So this is where it becomes a little tricky. The discussion of buying used equipment, I'm not gonna lie, I buy used equipment all the time. However, I actually buy used equipment from trusted beekeepers, because what can happen is that I'm not trying to say beekeepers are crooked, but just like in life, some people just are, right? Like I'm again, this isn't psychology, this is beekeeping. Sometimes maybe if a beekeeper knows that they can offload maybe some of their crappier equipment on you and still make some money, they might actually try. This is another thing too. If you're actually not buying nukes, but buying, say, a full colony. So if you're buying full colonies, a single would probably cost about 300. And if you're buying a double, it would probably cost closer to 400 or 450. The thing is, when you're buying singles and doubles, is that you're actually buying a lot of the equipment already too. So with a nuke, you're only buying the bees and about 3 or 4 frames, and then the box, the little cardboard box that they come in. But when you're buying full colonies, you actually get the bottom board, you get the brood chamber, you should be getting the inner cover, and you should be getting the lid. So if you are buying the full colonies, make sure you talk to the beekeeper and give them the expectations that this equipment is actually coming with the bees and that they're not keeping it. That, I guess, if you're going to start out beekeeping with nukes, I mean, when it's all said and done and you're buying your honey extraction and stuff, don't be surprised if you spend about $2,000. But
HIPAA mentions that Barks Apiary near Barrie has a starter kit for $189 and nukes are $250.
Okay, this then leads me into another discussion, and it's actually the importance of honeycomb And so when you're buying a nuke, that is the 4 frames. But the thing is with frames, and this is again, I wish I could have pulled them out of storage. There's a frame that actually has the foundation. So Pippa has a frame that has foundation. And just like a house, right? The foundation is there, and the foundation has little hexagons on it. There we go. You can see.
Are they all plastic now, Janine? They like used to be able to, like that kind of wax and wire. They don't have it anymore.
Regrettably, a lot of it is plastic. I have to say, it's plastic in the hive is kind of my nemesis. The nice thing about wax foundation is that the bees could actually chew ventilation holes through the wax foundation if they needed it. But with plastic, the bees can't do that. And in my opinion, it actually causes problems sometimes. Honey, that's a honey super frame. That causes less problems though. So it's a little bit better to use plastic foundation in your honey frames. That's okay. But in your brood frames, it could be better. So that's the foundation. The foundation has little hexagons on it. And that essentially just provides the foundation for which the bees then build out their honeycomb on it. So let it be known that the ratio for bees actually building wax comb, it's about 7 to 1. So it takes 7 pounds of honey approximately to make 1 pound of wax. In so much that for the bees to build the honeycomb takes a lot of potential honey away from producers and from yourself. So what I do is I actually, and honestly, any drawn comb, so the term drawn comb essentially means that these are the frames that have been drawn out and are actually complete with honeycomb that the bees have built out of the wax. So that drawn comb is worth its weight in gold, and it is worth a lot more than us beekeepers recognize. So if you could get drawn brood comb and drawn honeycomb, you can hit the ground running and you're off to the races. Because as a beginner beekeeper, I find when I'm actually mentoring beginner beekeepers, the majority of the problem is that their nukes use up a lot of their food resources, their honey, actually building out the rest of that comb. So if you have a 4-frame nuke and all you give them to build on is foundation, that's basically 6 more frames. If you're using 10, that's 6 more frames that the bees actually have to build out on their own using a lot of honey. And then of course that actually slows the queen down, because if the bees can't make the cells fast enough, then the queen can't lay. And then that's where you actually start having population issues. And it really doesn't necessarily allow the bees to really hit the ground running or go as fast as they really need to in order to actually make it for the winter. So if you can find drawn comb, especially brood comb, from a reliable beekeeper who doesn't necessarily use too many miticides or too many chemicals, I believe Al Lockhart actually down in Clarksburg still has some brood chambers for sale. And his stuff is pretty good. It can't be too old, so it shouldn't really be anything older than 15 years. But this is the thing about beekeeping, is that once you can kind of get yourself established and you take care of your equipment properly, all this is actually an investment into not having to spend any more in the future. So it may seem expensive in the beginning, but if you learn to store your things properly and treat them properly, it will see you through for about 20 years. Okay. I think we're actually moving now past equipment. Yes. So a quick diagram that I got actually from this really good book. I'd highly recommend this book to anyone. I actually have it in a slide at the end of the presentation too, if you don't get the chance to write it down. This is an excellent handbook. The drawings, of course, are really good because this drawing comes from the book. So location, location, location is integral to actually keeping your bees safe and healthy. So what this diagram actually shows is a northern windbreak. So it's protection from northern winds that can be really persistent in our area and really biting, obviously. You want your entrance to the hive to be facing either west or south. If you can kind of arrange it a little bit southwest, that'd be great, because then there's a lot of heat even in the wintertime, that the bees can then benefit from. And then of course you want air drainage away from the colonies. So you want a nice wind that will take any stagnant air away, because again, ventilation is actually really important to beehives. You actually also want some water nearby. When it gets really, really hot in the summertime, the bees will actually stop collecting nectar and start collecting water because they use it to air condition their hives with. Because again, the brood, those baby larvae, they need to stay at 32 degrees Celsius. They can't go any higher and they can't go any lower. So the bees have to work really hard at then air conditioning the hive if things get too hot. That's where, again, partial shade can actually really help your beehives not get too toasty in the summertime. And then of course, yeah, access to water. And then of course, think about accessibility for you. So is it a place where your car or your truck can drive up, so you're not humping those heavy honey boxes with your back or wheelbarrow forever until you can actually get to your vehicle? So try not to plunk your bees down in the middle of nowhere, basically. Try to make sure that you can drive up and collect that honey without breaking your back. Of course, this is what makes a poor apiary site. So kind of down on a floodplain where there isn't actually much kind of airflow. Cooler, damper air can collect at the bottom of a hill as well. And then of course, that hill is going to be mighty challenging when it comes time to hump, who knows, 120 pounds, 500 pounds of honey back up the hill. So there's a lot of consideration there. And again, try to point your entrance southwest facing as well. This is again, another diagram. This is a really good diagram, as nerdy as it looks. If we just kind of focus on the degrees centigrade, because I think that's how we all kind of operate. This is basically temperature and airflow are two things that I find a lot of beginner beekeepers don't necessarily consider when it comes to knowing about bees. So here, when it's really, really cold, minus 40 degrees, which is kind of where we actually almost got to, the bee cluster dies in the winter. And that can be actually, like, no matter how much honey that they have, no matter how many bees are on that hive, if they get too cold, they simply just fall asleep and they don't wake up. It's really sad. Moving through here, minus 40, so at around 10 degrees centigrade is when the bees start to get chilled. They actually struggle to stay alive. Not to stay alive, but they struggle to move, meaning to fly. So at around 10 degrees, they get chilled enough where they struggle to actually move their flight muscles. And then of course, at around 10 degrees is when the brood rearing stops. So the queens actually get that temperature cue to stop laying, because that, oddly enough, is when flowers and stuff can't really produce much nectar anyway. Going up to a little bit warmer, 21 degrees. If it gets too hot, then the queen actually stops flying as well. Excuse me. And then the cluster starts to form in between 10 and 20 degrees. And then of course, a lot of brood laying. So up here at 32.2 degrees Celsius is actually when that's your ideal nest temperature. Whoops, as I mentioned, whoopsie, wrong way here. Oh yeah, sorry guys. So that is your ideal nest temperature. That's when your larvae can stay nice and toasty and warm, and really nothing actually happens too much. And then of course, the warmer it gets, the more the bees actually have to work at keeping the hive cool. But then of course, the bees then can actually start making wax out of the nectar that they collect. And then here at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, that's when the ambient air temperature is. So when it gets too hot, as I mentioned before, all the brood rearing actually stops because the bees cannot keep the hive cool enough. And that's where they actually revert to collecting water instead of nectar and pollen. So again, temperature is certainly something that the bees take their cues from.
Pippa, you said that you took your temperature of your hive the other day. It was 82?
Yeah, it was 81.5. And that was just putting a an oven probe in through the top entrance just to check.
So that you're probably right in around here if it's 81. So you're definitely you're in the broodless winter cluster.
Yeah.
And that is totally an indicator that your cluster is obviously still doing pretty well.
Yeah.
they're pretty warm. Yeah.
I was
good.
happy.
Yeah, that's great. Fabulous. Okay. Just moving into touching briefly on honeybee diseases. There's nothing more devastating than actually realizing that your bees are sick. But there's a lot that you can do to actually not only prevent them from getting sick, but then helping them when they are sick. This is integrated pest management. This is an actual other course entirely. I have a stinky old cat in the way. Sorry. That's Reggie. He likes to be a Zoom star. So I implore you all to read up on disease management and then actually how to monitor and detect diseases. This is actually my specialty with what I specialized in when I was working at the Honeybee Research Center. I did a lot of projects on honeybee diseases. So again, I could probably talk for another 5 hours about this, but I'm not going to do that to everyone. If you can detect these diseases early, you can actually then save your bees. You can really give them a leg up because healthy bees really do quite manage their own health accordingly, right? If they're healthy, they can actually stay healthy. AFB stands for American Foul Brood. So foul brood, that's when your brood becomes foul, like stinky, Foul. It's a bacterial infection that basically turns your bee larvae into piles of really smelly goo. Once you smell American foul brood, you will never forget it. It's kind of like a fishy, dirty sweat sock odor. It's horrible. And it's like, I can actually recall it just in the back of my nose, and it's bad. However, this is actually one of the only cases where if you actually have American foul brood, it is by law that you actually have to seal up your hive, bees included, and burn everything. American foul brood is really contagious. There's no antibiotics that you can use to actually make them better. If American foul brood is detected, you actually have to kill your hive or your colony. Your colony is done. I have been present for 2 American foul brood incidences, and it is not pretty. Basically, what I witnessed and helped out with, we dug a big hole with a backhoe, popped the entire, we just tilted the whole beehive right in it, poured gas on it, and lit a match. And you have to burn everything because, again, it's really contagious. And if you don't, you're going to spread American foul brood to your neighbors, and you're actually going to spread it to the rest of your operation. It's the only real way. The way that you can actually monitor for American foul brood, your first and foremost is your sniffer. So again, that fishy kind of sweat sock odor. If you smell that, then you can move on to what's called the toothpick test. So if you don't have a toothpick at hand, you can get like a piece of grass, like dried grass outside. And basically, if you spot your puddle of larvae at the bottom of your cell, you can take that piece of grass or your toothpick and you dip it in the puddle, and then you slowly pull that stick out. And if there's a string attached, so if that goo is stringy, that's your American foul brood. If there's no string, I would say try it again and again, and not on the same like larva goo puddle. Try a different goo puddle, and try it like 4 or 5 times. And if you actually do detect the string test, and there's a string there, then of course you need to call the provincial apiarist and let them know. And then he or she will guide you through the processes of eliminating your hive. Moving into European foul brood, so EFB, same, oh yes.
So Pippa asked, do we have a problem around here?
Okay, so unfortunately, I would love to say no, but what American foul brood is it's bacteria in the environment. So again, your healthy bees, as long as you keep your bees healthy and they can actually go out and forage for the different kinds of medicine that they need, because it's actually been shown, there's been studies released now, that bees are actually able to self-medicate. So they will actually seek out, like say, thyme nectar or something that they need to be a little bit more antibacterial. The bees will actually know to go and find that. It's incredible. So American foul brood does just exist in the environment. There's really nothing that you can do. They actually have, they being the provincial, no, it's the Canadian Beekeepers Society. So the federal level beekeepers, they've made a decision now that there was this one antibiotic that you could get to put on your hives. It was called oxytetracycline, and it's an antibiotic. that you could actually just kind of put on as a preventative, but you actually now need a veterinarian prescription to use that. So if you detect AFB, it's actually almost too late. But if, say, your neighbor has beehives and they've actually got AFB, you could then contact a vet and say, I would like to be approved to actually use oxytetracycline on my hives. You might get approved, and then you could actually start treating them with that antibiotic. I'm going to put this out there right here, right now. Do not put anything in your hives while your honey is on. Don't use any antibiotics, don't use any miticides, don't use any harsh chemicals or synthetics while your honey is on, because that actually, well, you can poison yourself, but it is kind of the integrity of the whole beekeeping practice where we will keep our customers safe as well. So if you plan on giving people your honey, you don't want it laced with any pesticides or any antibiotics either. So yeah, do try to be mindful of your honey if you're actually treating your hives. So I hope that answered your question, probably, and then some. You have your European fallow brood. It is a less severe, less contagious fallow brood, so it is still bacterial. It's a different bacterium, and it actually has a slightly different smell to it. You can actually treat it with an antibiotic, and it does not do the string test. So the string test is actually pertinent or only applicable to American fallow brood. I hate to report that this now new nasty little pest called the small hive beetle has actually made it up from Essex County. It is indeed in Grey County now. I implore you all to actually study what an adult small hive beetle looks like. I will say that I detected small hive beetle in my hives in Durham, and I was actually really disappointed. I was devastated almost to find out that Durham actually has small hive beetle. And it's just now something that beekeepers just have to deal with. It's just another straw on that camel's back, unfortunately. But do be mindful of small hive beetle infestations. The larvae of these beetles can destroy and decimate your honey supers. The larvae love eating and making little gnarly, gross, greasy little nests inside your honey supers, and it can make such a horrible mess. Small hive beetles, if you let them get out of hand, can ruin all of your equipment and all your drawn comb. So there are traps out there that you can use. And then, yeah, just try to keep your colonies strong. If your colonies are actually strong enough and they have enough population, they will actually fight the adult beetles and like kick them out and stuff. So where you can actually expect to see these adult beetles is when you first open the hive. The beetles like to be kind of on frame position 1 or 10. So they'll be on the outside of the hive because the bees will try to be pushing them away, right? So if you see a beetle like scuttle up and out, try to snatch it. What I did is I actually caught one and I killed it, I crushed it, and I put it in this little container. Actually, I put it in an old queen cage, and I got a bee inspector. I sent it to a bee inspector and it came back positive as small hive beetle. So now I can be extra vigilant. Moving on to varroa mites. These are such a pain in the posterior. Usually if there's anything mysterious going on with your hive, if the bees just don't seem right, if they've kind of got wonky wings, if they're sickly and not doing very well, it's usually because they actually have varroa mites. There are various kinds of treatments that you can use. There are like more organic treatments you can use to knock the varroa mites down. What I actually highly recommend, and these are two different camps, as a scientist, as an apiculturalist, I really do believe that you can't not treat for mites. So there are people who actually believe that not treating for mites will somehow lead to better bees. And while that is the case, there is this thing called hygienic behavior. It is the case. Unfortunately, what it does is that it creates mite bombs. So even though these mites may not have killed 2 out of 5 of your hives, you still have 3 dead ones. And these 3 dead ones died because of the mites. And those mites are now probably going to move on to other operations. They're going to infest. They're just going to continue to infest. So what I actually use, and it's really good to actually switch up your treatments as well. So there is this one treatment, Apivar. It is an acaricide, so it's actually a pretty strong pesticide, basically. If you find that the mites are really, really quite problematic, and I heard that they were this year, don't hesitate again to use something a little bit with more oomph. Just make sure that your honey is off. I've actually been using Thymovar, so it's oil of thyme oil, and it's just kind of pressed into these little wafers. I've been using it for the past 5 years before I finally caved and I actually used some Apivar to kind of mix the treatments up, because mites are again, they're arachnids. So like they're related to like scorpions and spiders, but they're insects and like they don't want to die. So they actually develop resistance to the chemicals that we use. And so they're actually now coming up with the problem of mites becoming resistant to Apivar. So it's really important to not use the same treatment over and over and over again. And so even this year I caved and I used a little bit of Apivar instead of just my Thymovar, because I had realized that I'd been using Thymovar for 5 years. Even though it kept doing what I needed it to do, I did not want resistance to form. Viruses, there are at least 6 different kinds of viruses that the varroa mites can actually spread to the bees, which is another reason why you need to make sure that the varroa mites stay knocked down. Because these viruses, one of them being deformed wing virus, worker bees are literally kind of born without proper wings. And that is just a waste of resources. These workers can't fly, and they become a detriment to the colony, basically, because they can't go out and forage. And of course, it took up all those resources, all that bee bread, to actually rear all those bees for them to just be born deformed. So it is really taxing on the hive. Chalk brood is a fungal infection of the larvae themselves. It can usually be solved by either requeening, because again, it's just like a fungus infection that kind of attacks the brood, the larva. And if the bees aren't populated enough or healthy enough, then the chalk brood starts to win. These spores start to take over and actually making a break in the cycle. So if you squish the old queen and you introduce a new queen, that actually makes a break in the entire production cycle, and that knocks the spores down, right? Because there's no brood for the spores to live on. So that causes a break in the fungal cycle that then will actually hopefully be knocked down for the queen to start laying, your new queen to start laying healthy larvae or eggs. Pesticide poisoning is a thing that I could talk about forever. I've seen way too much, and it's devastating. Again, a lot of it can be mediated through a conversation with your neighbor, and basically asking them to either spray pesticides either on an overcast day or later on in the afternoon. You can actually also take screening, like for a screen door, and instead of closing up the entire hive, right, like locking your bees at home, you can screen the entrance, because that actually still allows for airflow, right? You don't want to seal the bees up because they'll suffocate, but you can screen off the entrances. If the farmer just doesn't have enough time or just needs to spray all day, you can kind of lock your bees in safe, but do use screen, don't suffocate them. Wax moth, pain in the butt. Skunks, pain in the butt. Mice, pain in the butt. And you can prevent all 3 of these. Mice, of course, you can use your entrance reducer, make sure it's the size of or less of their skull. Skunks love to eat bees. You can use a nail board. It sounds cruel, but you can actually just put a bunch of nails in a board and then have it sitting up. If you find that skunks are actually coming to eat your bees in the middle of the night, they'll scratch at the entrance and the bees will come out, and the skunks will just continue to eat bees. You can use a nail board. The skunks obviously have kind of naked pads, and they don't like stepping on nails. And so that will prevent the skunks from eating your bees. Just be sure that you're not stepping on the nails when you go to service your beehives. Wax moth can be kept safe. The way that Pippa sounds like Pippa's using Tupperware just like me. You can use mothballs, but I wouldn't use mothballs on my honey super frames, because then that's going to make your honey supers or your honey frames smell and taste like mothballs, right? So you're gonna have to be a little bit smart. Make sure that you actually, if you're storing your frames anywhere, that you store them out where it's cold and sealed. because that will keep the wax moth from infesting your honey frames or any of your drawn comb. Okay, what is our time? Because I would say that like okay, it's 3. How's everyone doing?
Are we on time or behind time, Janine?
Well, I'd written down that it was until 4, but if everyone's kind of under the impression that it is until 3.
Well, we had talked at one point that maybe people's butts would get numb in 2 hours, but we will be recording this. For those that have to leave us, you can catch up on the recording. If you have more time, Janine, you can keep rolling if that's what you choose, and we will keep going.
Right, because it's, oh my gosh, I know, like I actually do have maybe a bit of a problem where I can talk too much, but I told everyone that this is like my jam. I think what it is, basically like the rest, because this is kind of halfway through the presentation, which is why I put it in a break. The hive products is something that you could definitely read more about, and you could just read the slides. Because again, it's pretty straightforward. Like I don't really need to explain too much of what like propolis is or what honey is. It's just, again, there's like a lot of less kind of tricks of the trade involved with talking about hive products. Pollination is just really close to my heart. However, I do realize that the topic of this presentation is Beekeeping 101. Has nothing really to do with pollination, but of course, beekeeping certainly does. So again, that could be something that you could read through. And I actually always just take the opportunity whenever I have ears that will hear me to talk about other native bees and other pollinators. But these 3 subjects actually would be just fine for everyone to just maybe go through the slides to read. What actually I value the most is to either troubleshoot or to answer questions. So what I can do, if everyone's actually okay, I can end the presentation and we can actually just have an open discussion.
What are your thoughts, everyone? You can unmute.
Questions and discussion is always interesting, informative.
Something like that, yeah. No, that's
Does everyone
fine.
agree? So Janine, can we forward your presentation to everyone as well as the video recording? Perfect. You're muted, yep. So that's fine, we can do that?
Oh yeah, oh,
Cool.
of course, that's
Great.
for everyone.
Okay, so if we're going to get into a discussion, how do you want to handle this, Janine? Are you gonna start on different topics and we'll discuss, or does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I think it's just an open season here.
Just
Yep.
start talking.
I actually have a question. As far as we have 2 apple orchards, fairly new property, and we have a neighbor who's got a lot of bees, and he's going to bring some hives over. It's a case of when do you spray apple trees in the spring so you don't bother the bees?
Good question.
So to reiterate, I guess my understanding, because I've actually been working for certain beekeepers, and we do move hives into apple orchards for pollination. The spraying, though, is to actually also protect the blossoms, right?
We last year and the year before, we have a lot of those caterpillars,
Yes.
and so they basically ate everything. And
Mhm.
so we do have Severin, and I'm licensed, but I don't know a lot about apple trees and bees, so I'm just learning.
Yes. So I'll just impart some of the things that I know. I'm sure you know that for certain varieties of apples, you actually need 2 different varieties in order to get the desired variety. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. And then there is some windows that you actually do have to be mindful of. So you can spray, you can spray foliar sprays for your apple orchards before you invite the bees in. I would not recommend actually keeping bees in your orchard for this very reason. And it's because like if you need to spray, you won't actually have to worry about the beehives. So in most cases, at least for up in Meaford, a lot of the apple producers will invite beekeepers to bring their bees in, where no spray happens for about a week or 2. Pollination occurs, and then the bees get taken away. That's probably your best solution.
How far away from the apple orchards should the hives be? We have different places we can put them.
Yes. So during pollination, it should be, I believe, don't quote me. I think this is for blueberries, but it could be for apples. It's about 2 or 3 hives per acre. That may be different for apple trees. But then bees can actually navigate up to 3.5 kilometers away. So if you wanted to keep your bees safe, but then also be able to spray your hives, or sorry, spray your trees, you'd have to move them 3.5 kilometers away. Now, there is the caveat where if there's no apple blossoms, then obviously your bees aren't going to be going to those apple trees. So it's only really when the food source is out that the bees will be visiting that, and that's when you actually have to worry. So
Yeah.
when the apples are actually now then developing into their fruit, the bees will be elsewhere. But is the thing, you just kind of want to limit the amount of exposure to these pesticides that the bees have and give them a chance.
I'm sure that the neighbor who has 12 or 14 hives that does this regularly, we'll talk to him and he'll give us the best idea. His actual beehives are only less than a kilometer, but we don't seem to gain the benefit over here. And we have plums and pears and a bunch of different type of apple trees. And so we're just trying to make that better. That's all.
So at the end of my presentation, I do actually talk about a lot of the native pollinators. And because apple trees are actually native to North America, there's nothing better than a leafcutter bee to pollinate your apple trees. They are actually really, really well designed to do that job. Honeybees were brought in because we actually kept destroying the leafcutter bee habitat. So if you could actually start encouraging more habitat on your farm for these native bees to actually exist, you will no doubt get pollination services from native bees. And that's actually some of what I address later on in my presentation.
We'll look for that.
Yeah, there are definitely other bees out there that can do the job actually even better than honeybees.
Janine, Judy has a question in the chat box. I was told to place my hives facing southeast so the morning sun hits it first thing and gets the bees out working early. Why do you say southwest?
So if you think about it, I guess ideally, and this, as I keep saying, you ask 5 beekeepers how to do one thing and you get 10 different answers. My training at the Bee Lab was always southwest, in so much that that's actually the winter sun. So you get more exposure to more warmth when you kind of need the warmth the most. And that would then be exposure to the west as the sun is basically going through the sky, because basically the sun doesn't really spend too much time in the sky during the winter anyway. So you'd probably want to monopolize as it's actually setting. There's longer angles and ideally offering more heat. But southeast, as long as it's not north, I think it would be okay.
Other questions or comments?
I'm unmuted. I was just wondering, because right now I have double brood boxes and I want to split off, and I was thinking the single brood box would be brilliant. I've been watching the videos at University of Guelph, but rather than buying 5 honey supers, could I not take the first honey super off and empty it, extract it, and then put it back on the top? If you see what I mean?
Oh yeah, so that would
If I
be,
had 3 honey supers, it's a lot of work, but that way you wouldn't need as much equipment.
oh, it's true, yeah, and that's like you can kind of leapfrog, like you can actually like take 2 full supers off and extract that,
Mhm.
and then put those empty ones back on. As long as it's like, as long as, sorry, this is a colloquial term, as long as you don't get caught with your pants down and there's a huge honey flow like it happened to me when that canola was happening. I was literally caught, well, I wasn't caught with my pants down. I was caught with too few supers. So I actually had to emergency extract, because the bees were plugging themselves up so quickly. So if you get caught maybe in a dearth, so a dearth is when there's maybe a break in the nectar flow, feel free to extract some of your super so that you're ready for when there's another flow happening. Yeah, it's not a bad idea.
Okay.
Other comments or questions? Francis, as you look to, now that you've heard some of this great information, how are you feeling about launching into getting bees for the first time?
Well, very intimidated. Yeah, it's overwhelming right now.
Oh, no.
Because you don't think of all the, you think of keeping bees and you think of, okay, you have bees, you take the honey out and carry on, but there is so much more to it than what you would think.
But so much better to know what's ahead of you rather than launching into it and going, oh, I didn't know I had to do this.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Janine, is it normal for people to be intimidated initially?
Well, I will say it was certainly not my intent. To intimidate
Oh,
people.
just overwhelming.
Yeah,
And that was a ton of information thrown at you as well. So
exactly.
I apologize. However, it's like, I think this is just goes for anything new. You know, you can get a little overwhelmed, but understanding the nuances and a little bit of a deeper level than, you know, perhaps a book. Like I think I actually did go a little deeper on purpose today, just so that you're fortified in the spring. Like you actually, you know it's complicated, but then you're actually not as intimidated when you're going to begin.
What are some of your other favorite must-have books? If I was going to start beekeeping, what books must I read?
There's that Beekeeper's Handbook.
And where do I get these books?
Well,
Amazon.
yeah, or you can actually order them. Jessica's Book Nook in Thornbury. I always try to support local business. Jessica's Book Nook in Thornbury will get you any book basically that you ask for. She has a few beekeeping books there already. This one is kind of numero uno in my mind. This is more of like a manual, and it actually does basically pertain more to. It's from Connecticut, so it's kind of like similar weather, similar like winter. So do be mindful when you're buying beekeeping books, like they're not for beekeeping in the UK because they have a completely different winter there, right? Another really good book is The Hive and the Honeybee by Dayton. I'll be right back.
I'm sorry, Judy, I didn't see that your hand was up. So we'll get to you right after Janine finishes talking about her books.
Okay.
This one is a really good, unwavering, basically manual. So it's by Dayton. This is a beekeeping supply company in the States, and these guys definitely know what they're talking about. There, however, is maybe like less diagrams. Like if you're more of a visual person, this handbook is good, way better. I have had a glance at the Beekeeping for Dummies. I would say, to sound snobby, 65% passing grade. Anyway.
The Hive and the Honeybee is a very old book. At least I've seen some old versions. Do they have updated, or do you not need to update beekeeping?
There's new discoveries. Like if you're really getting into like all the extra science that's being revealed about bees, like that, there's new discoveries that happen every month. Hive and the Honeybee, I would say anything past like the mid 1970s, you're okay to get, because not much has really changed.
Cool.
Yeah.
Judy, you had your hand up. You had a question or a comment?
I was just going to say for the new beekeepers, it becomes less intimidating the more courses you can take and the more books you can read. Watching the University of Guelph videos are really good. I think I've watched them all 2 or 3 times. I just joined a bee club, and I think that's going to help too.
And where is that bee club out of, Judy?
Actually, it's Huron County, so it's called the Ozable Bee Club. Most of the meetings are on Zoom too, or right now they're on Zoom. So it didn't matter that it maybe wasn't close by.
Do we have a bee club locally, Janine?
I believe it was either Carmody Stemler or Hugh Simpson that were holding the Grey Bruce Beekeepers Society, I think.
Yeah.
I haven't seen much meetings. Maybe it's time for me to throw my hat in the ring. Who knows?
Cool. Sorry, I interrupted you, Judy.
No, that's okay. And the first year I did not get any honey. I didn't really expect to. I thought it'd be nice if I did. It'd be a bonus, but no, my bees got all the honey. And so it was more about just learning about the bees and watching them build their comb. And that was all really quite fascinating. Maybe this summer, if I'm lucky, I'll get some honey.
Cool. Murray, do you have any questions or comments? Sorry, Janine, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say that's like completely normal and completely expected, where it's about like the 3-year mark where you actually start to hit your stride as a beekeeper. Yeah.
That's good to know. Murray, did you have thoughts or questions?
I was wondering, what do you feed the bees, like for food?
Good question.
So basically in the fall, okay, so it's you can actually either buy kind of industrial made sugar syrup, and that's just like a high fructose kind of corn syrup, or you can make it yourself by basically dissolving like granulated white sugar, so the 2 kilogram
Yes.
bags, in hot water. But there are ratios that you need to use. So in the fall time, you actually need to feed a 2-to-1 ratio. So it's 2 sugar, 1 water. So you actually have to make that sugar syrup as dense as possible, like as sugary as possible. And that's actually to mimic really, really dense nectar. And in the fall time, you actually want to give them as concentrated sugar syrup as possible so that they can convert it into kind of like fake honey so that they can store it for the winter fast enough. It's also not hot enough really for them to evaporate all that excess moisture. But in the springtime, you can actually feed them a 1-to-1 ratio. Again, you're kind of just mimicking nectar, but you can do a 1-to-1 ratio in the spring. And by that time, the bees, it's going to be warm enough. There's more honey coming or more nectar coming, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah.
So how do I know when to start feeding? Like you say, the fall and the spring. How do I know that I need to feed?
Right. And again, 3 hours clearly is not cutting it. But so usually there's like a rhythm that you can fall into when it comes to beekeeping. Again, this year depends on where you're located, but there really wasn't much in the lines of fall honey. So basically when you want to time it so that you take your honey off, but then you leave the bees with enough chance to basically top up their brood chamber with enough fall honey of their own. And then feeding in the fall is for them to get topped up even more so that they actually are more than 40 pounds going into the winter. So, you know by basically how much kind of like goldenrod and aster you've seen maybe out in bloom. You can actually kind of, when you're going around, and actually this is another thing too, for a lot of treatments, so if you're treating with apivar or thymovar for your mites after your honey comes off, it's actually really important that you don't do that while they're feeding. So you kind of have to, again, time everything where you take the honey off, you treat, and then you have to feed really quickly after the treatments are done. So you have to kind of time it appropriately. But then, yeah, it all is dependent. So honestly, don't hesitate either. Maybe while you're treating your hives, you can pick up the back of your hive a little bit to see how heavy it actually is. And if it comes up really easily, you definitely have to feed. If it comes up a little bit easily, like you want that hive to be as heavy as possible going into the winter.
Cool.
They also get to a point where they won't keep taking food. Like if they have enough, they won't keep taking the feed that you offer them.
That's right. Yes.
So but it changes every year, March-ish.
And there's this great little cheat. I'm going to try to describe it. There are these what are called rims. So it's a specialized piece of equipment. You can actually make it yourself, but it's like 1.5 inch rim that basically like bumps up the lid from the top of your inner cover, where I actually, for emergency feeding, basically in the spring, like if they're about to starve, I get kind of medium to large size Ziploc containers, and I'll make emergency bee feed by just dissolving granulated sugar in hot water. I'll fill those Ziplocs up with the bee feed, and I'll leave a little space of air at the top. I'll lock up the Ziplocs. I'll take that Ziploc out to the beehive. I'll plunk down one of the rims, right? Because then the rim is going to pop the lid up and over the height of the Ziploc. And when you lay the Ziploc bag down, there's actually an air bubble that comes up. And I'll take an X-Acto knife and I'll put 2 slits in where the air bubble is. And then that actually allows a slow trickle of the feed, the sugar syrup to come out. So then it's not flying all over the place and it's not drowning the bees, but the bees can come up and actually lick it up and then basically use it to survive off of it. It is a lifesaver. And then actually you can quite often, I'll put more sugar syrup in like a watering can, and you can actually just fill the bag back up and keep feeding the bees to kind of see them through those really rough springs like we had this spring. I think I fed like 5 times this spring. Yeah.
I was just thinking back to your bee club idea. The bee guys used to meet here in our boardroom when life was normal. So if you ever want to form a club, Janine, you can use our boardroom free of charge in the evenings if that works for you. So
Oh,
we
boy.
haven't heard from Nadia, Jack and Linda, or Paul B. Do you guys have any comments or questions? You can type them in the chat box or speak. I see someone unmuting. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, hey, that was excellent. We did a lot of trial and error with our bees over the last 4 or 5 years. And you really summarized things really, really nicely. One of the things that we really put energy into around our farm was making sure there was tons of wildflowers and actually harvesting the seeds from other areas to put in right near the bees. And there's probably about 30 yards by 10 yards of sunflower bed. And they just go nuts over it. They just love it. And I'm sure that's why we got a good bit of honey this year. And we left tons for them. So yeah, it's those are some of the things that we did. One of the things that I had heard, and I think it was 2 years ago, the hornets, oh man, they got into the, they were actually forcing the bees out to defend the hives. There was that many. And we were told if you put the inner cover backwards from the opening of the hive, that seemed to, and that's what we've done every year since. And we haven't had the same problem, whether that 1 year was just unusual because of the number of hornets, I'm not sure, but we haven't had that problem since. Have you had any, do you have any feedback or thoughts about hornets with your populations?
Has anyone else had like a kind of a hornet or yellow jacket infestation problems? No.
Not really. And I usually use the mouse guard with, the metal one. And that seemed to help keep them out. When I was extracting the honey or taking off the supers, the yellow jackets showed up like crazy, but the hive was strong enough to fight them off. So it wasn't like an issue in the hive.
Yeah.
But they're a pain.
Yeah, no, we put the mouse excluder things in like sort of the last thing as we're doing the medication in the fall. So that's an interesting thought as well. Okay, good. Once again, thank you. That was just, that rocked. That was really enjoyable.
Janine, do you have comments about how you handle hornets? Or do you not have a problem?
Yeah, so there's kind of like the ebb and flow to a lot of things in nature, right? Like there can be, it happens with deer, which is why, people are encouraged to hunt them at certain times. It depends though too, you got to know what kind of wasp you're dealing with. So if it's a yellow jacket, I know that they actually sometimes nest in the ground. And quite often too, it's about kind of creating an entire ecosystem. So that is what kind of the rest of my presentation is about. I actually do mention like growing food for everyone, basically, like the importance of growing sunflowers for bumblebees. Because again, if you can kind of establish almost like a well-balanced kind of ecosystem, there will be things like the skunks who would actually much prefer eating those wasps and hornets than the bees. And if these wasps or hornets or yellow jackets are living in the ground, I mean, that's even easier for the skunks to access. So allowing things to live will eventually end up basically striking a balance between everyone, and you'll actually have less of these kind of crazy cycles. And when it comes to hornets, I'm not sure people use those paper nests because hornets or wasps actually use that visual cue. It's almost like more of an occupancy thing where those kind of dud nests or like the phony nests really do prevent wasps from like making them under your deck and all that stuff. So yeah.
Cool. Paul, do you have any comments or questions? Perhaps not.
No, I'm good.
Cool, great. Anything else you want to share, Janine?
I'm happy that there was this level of interest in this course today, and I thank you all for coming out. And
I was just thinking about bears. You know, a lot of the people here are local to Markdale area. Judy isn't, but many of the other ones are. Do you experience bear problems at your hives? And what do you do?
that's a great question. Of course, I've encountered actually several problems with bears, but this is for when I was actually working for the commercial beekeepers. So one of them, I mean, I've been to several yards that clearly have just been tossed by bears. Like black bears will just come in and they'll just throw everything around and make a horrible mess. Get pictures, because if you're registered with the OBA, you can actually get some money out of the destruction that the bears have done. So take pictures. If you find that the bears keep tossing your bee yards, there's an electric fence option that you can use. This sounds really cruel, but I don't really think it is. But one of the classic beekeeper tricks that we use is that if, yes, you're finally forced to actually set up an electric fence, well, you do the first time. So you set it up and you actually crank the voltage of the fence, and you kind of bait. You can actually put, I've seen it, it's like an empty sardine can, and you put it on the wire. The bear comes along and has a lick and gets zapped really badly and
never comes again.
Never come back. And then quite often, like, it's just, you can leave it on, but like on low, because again, it's just the association, because animals are actually pretty smart. And if they learn that lesson the first time, then they probably won't bother it. Yeah.
So if I
have a
have,
friend-
sorry, Pippa, what?
I was gonna say, I have a friend, Jocelyn, who's got beehives just past Kimberley on the way to Thornbury from here, and he has a bear wire or an electric fence on all the time, because you just have so much to lose if a bear gets in, and he's far enough out that it could be an issue.
Yeah.
Mhm.
If I have one hive, do I have to register with OBA?
I mean,
Yes.
yes, it would be nice to go renegade. It actually doesn't cost anything to register. And then of course you get newsletters, and then you get kind of like, I hesitate to say group insurance, but yeah, you get to be a part of something. And then of course, if you actually get small hive beetle, or if you fear that you actually have it, you're already registered, which means that you can get a provincial apiary or a provincial bee inspector to come out and diagnose that problem for you too.
That's cool.
That's a good service.
It also does help, because then if you have like AFB or one of those nasty diseases, then me as your neighbor would know, where it is, if I need to be more alert, if I need to be taking precautions and that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
they do give a lot of good information.
Great.
Yeah.
And is the bee course still offered, the couple day course that people used to take? My husband took it years ago. They still have that?
At U of G?
Yeah.
I think so. It might be virtual. I had the pleasure of actually teaching those for several years. I would say that they would still offer it, but again, you might want to check in the registration. They might indeed be full already. But yeah.
Was an excellent course.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's good stuff.
Okie dokie.
I
If
will
no
say-
other question, pardon, Janine, what?
I just have one
Yes.
hopefully final comment. If you are actually buying full-sized colonies from someone, I highly recommend bringing someone perhaps more experienced with you. I was actually purchasing colonies for a research project, and I think I drove all the way out to Lake Huron, kind of north of Bayfield. And this one gentleman maybe assumed that I didn't know what I was looking at. And not only did he try to sell me colonies that didn't even have a queen, he tried to sell me colonies that were actually infected with AFB.
Good
And
Lord.
so I did my own inspection. He's like, yeah, those are them. Just go pick them up. Like, they're all ready. I'm like, actually, I'm going to be looking at these first.
Yeah.
And when I saw AFB in one of the hives, I was like, well, we're going to a different yard. because I'm not getting anything from this yard. So again, purchasing full hives, unless you trust the beekeeper, I strongly recommend you bringing someone perhaps with a little bit of a better trained eye with you.
I thought you had to get like a permit to sell used equipment because it has to be checked by the Ontario Bee Association to make sure we're not selling things and having it spread around Ontario. It's not, you don't pay for it or anything, but it's just like a certification that your hives are clean that you're selling. Is that not the way they do it?
I would just be honest and say that beekeeping's still a little roughly the Wild West. There's a lot that's not regulated, and
Right.
yeah, my little crystal ball. Actually, my biggest problem right now is urban beekeeping. It is probably something that really needs to be regulated like ASAP. But yeah, you're right. But it really doesn't happen regularly.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat box, Janine. Where do you market your honey, and is there a marketing board?
Yes. So you actually have to, if you're going to produce honey, and if you're going to become a person who wants to have their honey at someone's store, you actually have to have a certified honey house. So there's the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. There's a lot of information on the Ontario Beekeepers website about this. If you wanted to become an actual like honey seller or honey producer, there are roughly three very important things that you need to do. And so, yeah, I would steer you then towards reading about that on the OBA website, because yeah, you do need to become certified for that. Your labels for your honey actually have to have really specific information on it. For me, I don't really market my honey. It's called farm gate sales, and that's a bit of a loophole. But again, that's why I was actually really serious when I was telling everyone that you do not put any chemicals on your hives when your honey is on, because there's no guarantee that someone has actually abided by that. Because sometimes there is a little bit maybe more careless beekeeping, and you really sometimes don't know if you're just buying honey from a farm gate what's actually in it, right? So we all have to just make sure the honey still stays pure.
So if I am doing farm gate sales, I don't have to be certified?
I believe that is the loophole. Don't quote me. It could be different in other provinces, but I believe that is actually kind of the way around becoming certified. Yeah.
And if I'm selling like barrels of honey to, Billy Bee or whatever, do I have to be certified to do that as well?
Yes, and that actually then comes to even like what your bottom boards are made out of, or like what your honey pallets are made out of. The CFIA has really strict rules as to what actually your honey house should look like. So yeah.
Cool.